Hi folks. So I read recently two quite different, what I would describe as English catastrophe books, and I thought it might be fun to compare them. There are some quite marked differences between them, I think. I will attempt to avoid any excessive spoilers. So the two books concerned are Fugue for a Darkening Island, which was first published in 1972. This copy is from 1978. It's very slender, about 120 pages, so you can bash through it pretty fast. And the second one is Shelter by Dave Hutchinson, which is a more recent book from just a few years ago. I think 2019, I believe. Let me just see. Close. 2018, in fact. So 5-6 years ago. So there's a number of different dimensions that we could use to compare the two books. I think I'm going to start with the nature of the catastrophe, because they're quite different in the two books. So in Shelter, the catastrophe is an act of God, and it's only referred to obliquely in the past. It's a kind of fact of life. It's 100 years ago. So the sisters are fragments of, or were fragments of a comet that struck the Earth, causing widespread devastation. And depending on whether you were like the US, sorry for all of you in the US, was absolutely wiped off the face of the planet by an enormous fragment hit there, and then bits of Europe, France was destroyed. So the sisters laid waste to vast swathes of the planet and triggered not quite a nuclear winter, but so-called long autumn, where enough crap was put up into the atmosphere that it cooled the planet down, and it was a bit dingy, kind of like a rainy October day, that kind of weather, for about 100 years. So food production grinds to a halt. Logistics, supply chains are all destroyed. Cities empty of people because no one can survive there, and most starve or are killed by roving gangs. So the useful, the careful, the practical, the strong, the lucky few survive by finding or taking somewhere secure and defensible that they can use to live in, like a farmhouse or a stately home, or somewhere in the country. So in Fugue for a Darkening Island, the disaster is entirely man-made, and it's in the relatively recent past. There's been a nuclear exchange in Africa. All the big cities have been wiped out. We don't really know why there was a nuclear exchange, it just was. So large swathes of the continent are uninhabitable, and people are fleeing for their lives. Millions and millions of people have pitched up in Europe as refugees, and a good couple of million of them have found their way to the shore of England in the south, and in pretty quick succession. And then there's a right-wing populist government in control, elected on a wave of fear of the immigration waves. Sounds strangely familiar. So they're trying to clamp down on it, fighting a rising tide of people fleeing for their lives, and wanting to make a new home in England. So the poor old refugees, the African immigrants, the AFRIMs as they're abbreviated to in this book, who are so desperate that they're willing to fight, manage to arm themselves, and they becomes an armed struggle on the shores of England. And that's really where the book starts. So two quite different types of catastrophe. One an act of nature or God, and in the dim and distant past, 100 years previously, and all of the dying, or most of it anyway, already happened in the in this book, Shelter, and in this case, it's happening as we read it. So let's talk protagonists. There's quite a comparison there too. So and really you could summarize it by saying that in this book, the protagonist, a guy called Alan Winter, is kind of weak in every sense, venal, selfish, ordinary, really. He is not your hero type, very clearly, and that we get that sense right from the very beginning. In contrast, Adam Hardy is the second or third generation survivor. We're 100 years down the track, and all of the kind of incompetent, fearful, weak people were killed off decades ago. So he seems more competent because he is more competent. So he's been trained. He's effectively a spy, not quite a James Bond type, but he can handle himself. Whereas poor old Alan from this book is a sort of middle manager, bureaucrat, office worker type in the suburbs with his semi-detached house. He is woefully, like most people would be, ill prepared for the end of the world. So Alan, kind of poor old Alan, gets buffeted along by events really, and most of the decision making is taken out of his hands. He has no control, whereas Adam, rather than being buffeted along by events, is driving them. He is trained, he's well briefed, he's well supported, and he is action oriented. He is the type that will kind of grab events by the scruff of the neck and make them happen the way that he needs them to. For the most part, he doesn't go all his own way, but for the most part, he's able to do that. What I was forced to realise though when I was reading the two protagonists is that I think, sadly, I suspect that Alan Winter is much more realistic a protagonist than Adam Hardy from Shelter. He's a normal guy with his kind of hang-ups and foibles, and okay, it's from the early 70s, so it's 50 odd years out of date from a sensibilities point of view, but he'd be a pretty typical person. How many of us would manage anything more than being buffeted along by events as they unfold? How many of us would really be heroic or able to handle ourselves or whatever? I think most of us would be more like Alan than Adam, I fear. So what about the structure then? So Shelter reads more like a linear story. We basically follow Adam as he makes kind of slow progress across the south of England to investigate the thing he's been told to investigate or infiltrate. And then as he battles his way out, we follow him as he makes his way on foot back again. So there's no transport. It's horses, basically, horse and cart and feet. That's really what's available to you. And then on his way back, he stumbles across a minor civil war, is too strong a term for it, more like a local feud that's gone bad. Whereas the plot structure for Fugue for Darkening Island is anything but linear. It's in places it's more like staccato bursts of reportage, snatches from a diary or a memoir or something like that. We get glimpses of Alan's past, not particularly glorious past, his dalliances, his meeting his future wife, ongoing casual infidelities, and other disappointments. And these are sometimes very brief, a matter of a few lines, and at times it feels like you're being sort of briefly machine gunned with words by Christopher Priest. It's as like I say, it's staccato bursts of background. So those are interspersed with things that are happening right now or happened recently, where it's a kind of Alan narrating the story. But Shelter was a more of a page turner. You could read that. It reads as a story, and you go from part A to part B to part C to part D. It's not formulaic as such, but it's more traditional story structure. And this one is a little bit, makes you work a little bit harder. I mean, it's much shorter, so you can read it in very easily in one sitting. Sometimes you get halfway through a paragraph and you think, hang on a minute, is that happening now? Because there's no clues given, you just read it, and then you're meant to be smart enough to follow along to figure out that that's a flashback, not something that's happening right now. So both enjoyable, but for different reasons. From a location point of view, both are set in the south of England. One thing that I particularly loved about Shelter is that it's set very near to me. So maybe a 10-minute drive up the road is where quite a lot of the action happens. It's an area that I know well. Quite a lot of my trail running is around that area, so the place names I'm very familiar with. The sort of ancient throughways that they describe as being a sort of renewed thoroughfare for horses and so on, I recognise. I've run up there many times, so it was fun to imagine those places in 100 years time with barbed wire fences and walls built around them, and machine gun nests, signs saying keep out and that kind of thing. So it did, although I'm not unfamiliar with the places in the other book, in Fugue for Darkening Island, this was much closer to home, so there was an extra frisson of interest from that, I thought. So what about tone? Well, they're quite different. So Fugue for Darkening Island, as the name possibly suggests, is dark. There's not much positive that happens in it. We're not meant to like or respect the protagonist. Chaos and casual violence in the book are just dark. I certainly felt the lack of control that Alan has on his situation. He's not in any form of control. He's, like I said before, he's buffeted along by events. He has no power. Other people with guns have the power. There's no real hope in this situation. I think all we really get in by way of a chink of light at the end, the very end of the book, is the merest hint that Alan might have grown a pair, and maybe about to embark on some kind of Mad Max revenge mission. But that's only like a sentence or two at the very end of the book, so you don't see it or hear any of that. Unfortunately, that might have been a more fun book, but perhaps a small nod in the direction of some redemption for what was otherwise a fairly weak and unlikable character. Shelter, on the other hand, is a different beast, where the catastrophe is 100 years behind us. We're well past that now. Some sense of order has been re-established in places, in small patches. Some have notions of imposing some kind of rule by force, of installing themselves as some kind of minor king or tin pot dictator. And that's what Adam has gone off to investigate in the east of England as a potential threat. Even the tin pot dictator is interesting. Whilst many would disagree with his methods, there is some grudging recognition that he at least makes the proverbial trains run on time. The things are organised, food production is adequate for the population, things are getting fixed up, windows are being repaired, houses are being made livable again, which is all well and good. But the locals are being rather brutally oppressed, and any dissension is roughly handled. So it's not ideal by any means. In general, though, there is, as I say, a patchwork of strongholds. There's safety in numbers. With family groupings decades in the making at this stage. Life is difficult, but it is life. Whereas in Fugue, it's all going down the pan very rapidly. One thing that's quite different in Fugue is we're getting Alan's perspective, so we're getting a very kind of narrow, low definition view of the unfolding catastrophe. It's one man's view, what he can find out, which isn't much, and what he can glean from other people that are caught in the same bind as he and his family are. We're getting a one-man view of that unfolding breakdown of law and order, increasing violence and chaos. So having abandoned their suburban home right at the very beginning due to nearby fighting, which is not something you expect to hear on a suburban street. So from living in their comfortable middle-class home to abandoning their home, with streets being barricaded, and we're in a world of, just in a few short months, we're in a world of tented whorehouses on the village green, barricaded streets, shifting factions, paranoia, suspicion, and a dog-eat-dog world of survival. We don't get a bird's eye sort of god level narrator. We get Alan's blinkered views of what he sees, what he knows, and what people that he's come across have seen and been able to tell him, which isn't necessarily accurate or true. To me, Priest's book Fugue for Darkening Island felt more urgent, more current, more now. I really felt the kind of collapse in our sort of safe Western societies, in our comfortable middle class homes. Obviously, we read the news, we hear about people in impossibly difficult situations fleeing their homes for their lives. There's more than a few of those situations happening right now in the world. But we can't or don't want to imagine what that might be like for us, for ourselves, and for our families. And A Fugue for Darkening Island kind of lays that all out there, and it's not a fun read. So they are quite different as catastrophe books go. It's difficult for me to say which of them I enjoyed more. Shelter is 100 years removed from the trouble, so it's a little bit mellower as a result, and you get some sense of hope that things are moving on. Kind of, there's an element of one step back, two steps forward, but generally it's more positive and hopeful in tone. Although the body count's pretty high, a lot of people die in that book. I did like the fact that Shelter was, as I said before, set locally to me, and that made it more enjoyable, I think. On the other hand, Fugue was dark and harrowing and a little bit too easy to imagine, in fact, which is a worry in itself. And as I say, I found it all too easy to imagine how I would cope, or rather wouldn't cope, in a similar situation. I do enjoy the writing of both authors. I've read several of Dave Hutchinson's book before, and I've read a couple of Christopher Priest's now. Priest in this guise at least is more sparse and more austere in his writing style, perhaps to suit the situation in the story. Whereas in this book, at any rate, Hutchinson takes the time to kind of colour in the background to give you a bit more context and a bit more story. There's a bit more, you can kind of luxuriate a little bit in the world building, if you like. Then again, he's got the time to it. It's more than double the length of the other book. Overall, I think I enjoyed Shelter a touch more than Fugue for Darkening Island, but there's not much in it, like half a point. So I think I gave this an 8 and the other one 7.5. So they were both good, both in their own way. I do like an end of the world story, and I do particularly like an English end of the world story, as it just makes it more real, I think. So I'm going to do a bit more research and find some other English catastrophe books to add to the ones that I've already read. These two, there's a couple of John Wyndham books that I would put in that category. Maybe I'll try and do a looking at several more of those books at some point in the future. Have you read either of these? What did you think of them? Do you like an end of the world story? Do let me know in the comments. As always, I'd be very happy to hear from you. As always, thank you for watching, and until next time, goodbye for now.